Did you know that some of Hollywood's most iconic stars had beauty routines that would leave you absolutely speechless today? We're talking about rituals so strange, you'd wonder if they belonged in a sci-fi film instead of a skincare routine. From not bathing for months to keep their natural musk, to smothering their faces in Vaseline. Yep, you heard that right. These stars were willing to go to extreme lengths to keep their glamorous image intact. Jean Harlow's hair care. She was the original platinum blonde, but the lengths she went to keep that iconic hair color were, well, kind of wild. And it's hard to blame her, her hair was her signature look. Of course, she would do anything to maintain it, but somehow she went a bit too far. You know how we worry about using too much heat on our hair or how the wrong shampoo can dry it out? Well, Jean Harlow was dealing with problems on a whole different level. Back in the 1930s, she wasn't just using some nice salon-grade toner or highlights. No, Jean was practically bathing her hair in a brutal cocktail of peroxide and ammonia. Stuff that would make any modern stylist cringe. Well, in her defense, this was before the days of gentle conditioning bleaches. It was like she was frying her hair with chemicals. She and her hairdresser had a secret mix that they kept under wraps, but it was essentially straight-up bleach, and she'd do it again and again, all to keep up that platinum look that became her signature. But then, if you think about it, it kind of paid off. That look made her a superstar. The studio loved it, the fans loved it, and she was often called the blonde bombshell because of that striking hair. But there's always a price to pay, and in this case, the peroxide wasn't kind to her scalp. We're talking burns, scabs, thinning hair. It got so bad that her hair started falling out in patches. The pain must have been excruciating, but Jean was committed. She wasn't about to change her look, even if it meant wearing wigs to cover up the damage when things got really rough. On top of all that, she didn't have the luxury of stepping back and letting her natural hair grow out, because that platinum blonde was her whole brand. And that's the thing with old Hollywood, right? It's easy to get caught up in the glamour, but behind the scenes, they were often doing some pretty extreme stuff to stay on top. Jean's story is a little bit tragic too. She passed at a young age, just 26, due to kidney failure. And while her hair struggles might seem like a small detail in the grand scheme of things, it shows that she was a woman trying to meet impossible standards. Lombard chilling baths. Every single morning, without fail, Carol would take an ice-cold shower. And I mean ice-cold, not just lukewarm or a little chilly. Most of us wouldn't dream of doing that, but for Carol, it was a ritual. She swore by it, claiming it helped keep her skin tight, glowing, and youthful. Now, this wasn't some modern-day wellness trend she picked up. This was back in the 1930s when people weren't exactly talking about cryotherapy or cold plunges. But Carol believed that if you wanted to look fresh, you had to wake yourself up the hard way, and she truly thought the shock of cold water would keep her skin from sagging, almost like a daily facelift without the scalpel. In her Hollywood mansion, maybe just before a long day of shooting, up before the sun, steeling herself for that frigid splash. She'd step into that cold stream like it was nothing, probably laughing at the idea of it bothering her. Because that was Carol for you. Fierce, unafraid, and willing to do whatever it took to keep up her glamorous image. It's funny to think about, right? A big movie star in the comfort of her elegant bathroom, shivering through this freezing ritual every morning, all for the sake of keeping her skin taut and her cheeks rosy. But it also tells you something about how seriously they took their beauty routines back then. There wasn't any room for laziness in the Hollywood of Carol's time. It was all about commitment to the craft, and in her case, that meant braving a little discomfort every day. Now maybe, just maybe, she was onto something, because even today people still talk about how stunning and vibrant she was right up until the end. Joan Crawford's compulsive cleaning. Now this is quite the story. If you want to talk about someone who took cleanliness to a whole new level, Joan Crawford takes the cake. Some say she was a germaphobe or had OCD even though she was never clinically diagnosed. But she wasn't just neat, she was obsessed with being clean. And when I say obsessed, I mean scrubbing her hands until they bled and wiping down everything in her house like it was an operating room. Her morning routine wasn't just about a quick tidy-up or making sure the cushions were in place like most of us would do. No, Joan went into full-on battle mode with dirt and germs. She had this habit of scouring her hands over and over again, using the strongest soaps she could find. It got to the point where her skin couldn't keep up, cracked, raw, sometimes even bleeding, but that didn't stop her. It's as if she believed that she could wash away all the bad things around her, both in her home and in her life. And it wasn't just about her hygiene. Her entire house was treated like a pristine sanctuary. Joan would march through the rooms with a cloth in hand, wiping down doorknobs, countertops, and even the floors. As a matter of fact, the joke among some of the people who worked for her was that you could eat off any surface in her home, because frankly, you probably could. She would even rearrange her staff's work if she thought they hadn't cleaned thoroughly enough, showing them how it should be done with that meticulous attention to detail. But it's easy to see how this wasn't just about keeping a clean house. Hollywood can be a tough place, and Joan had to claw her way to the top. Maybe her obsession with cleanliness was about control, because in a world where so much could slip through her fingers, like youth and fame, she could at least control how spotless her home was. But there's this darker side to all of these too. You might have heard about her strained relationships with her kids. Her daughter, Christina, famously wrote about it in Mommy Dearest. Joan's need for order and perfection spilled over into every part of her life, including how she raised her children. She'd reportedly freak out if their clothes weren't pressed just right or if a toy was left out of place. So, while it might seem extreme that she scrubbed her hands raw or couldn't rest until every surface was gleaming, you can almost see how it fit into her world. She was a woman who knew how much appearances mattered in Hollywood, and maybe, on some level, she believed that keeping everything perfectly clean could keep the chaos at bay. It's a little sad and a little fascinating how this glamorous star with that perfectly composed face and those stunning costumes was fighting her own battle with mess and imperfection behind the scenes. Ava Gardner's cologne principle. Unlike a lot of Hollywood actresses back in the day, Ava didn't spend hours in front of the mirror obsessing over their beauty routines. No, she had a very laid-back attitude when it came to keeping fresh, and it's kind of legendary in its own right. You see, she had this habit of skipping out on regular showers. Instead, she'd rely on a splash of her favorite cologne to keep things fresh. But the word splash is a bit of an understatement. She practically bathed in the stuff. Her scent was said to linger in the air long after she'd left a room. It was one of those little quirks that made her so fascinating. This effortless glamour that wasn't about being perfectly put together, but more about her raw, untamed charm. It's almost like she figured she wouldn't waste time with all that scrubbing when she's got a good bottle of perfume, and honestly, who was going to tell Ava Gardner she needed to change? She had that wild, earthy beauty that somehow made the whole thing work. People weren't drawn to her because she was perfectly manicured or squeaky clean. They loved her because she had this aura of mystery and sensuality that no one could quite put their finger on. Ava lived a life full of passion and drama. Globe-trotting adventures, whirlwind romances, late nights that turned into early mornings. She'd spend time with people like Frank Sinatra, who she famously married, and travel to far-flung places like Spain, where she immersed herself in the local culture. It's easy to imagine her sipping on a glass of wine, laughing until dawn, and then freshening up with a spritz of cologne before facing the next day. Sure, some folks thought it was a bit unconventional, especially in a time when Hollywood was all about presenting this polished, almost unreal image. But Ava never cared much about playing by the rules. She had this almost defiant confidence, a sense that she didn't need to apologize for being exactly who she was, and that's what made her unforgettable. Her fans adored her, not because she was flawless, but because she felt real, like the kind of star who didn't mind getting a little messy while living a life most people could only dream about. In a way, her casual approach to hygiene was just part of her mystique. She wasn't afraid to cut corners if it meant she could get back to the things she really cared about: living, loving, and enjoying the moment. And in classic Ava fashion, she made even that look glamorous. Bette Davis's unconventional eye care. Imagine being famous for how striking and beautiful your eyes are, the kind that could pierce right through an audience from the silver screen. Well, Bette Davis had a pair of eyes like that, and when it came to taking care of them, she wasn't about to leave it to chance. She knew how to work her angles, and she was always looking for ways to make those eyes stand out even more. Her solution was simple, a little dab of petroleum jelly on the lids. It gave her eyes this extra shine, catching the light just right so that they practically glowed during close-ups. Now, you might be thinking, petroleum jelly near the eyes? Wasn't that kind of risky? And you'd be right. It's not exactly the most hygienic product to slather around such a delicate area. But for Bette, it wasn't about playing it safe. It was about getting that perfect shot. If a little shine could make her eyes look more intense or dramatic on film, then she was all in, even if it meant the occasional clogged pore or irritation. Back in those days, they didn't have all the specialized cosmetics we do now. No lightweight highlighters or eyeglosses, just the basics and a lot of creativity. And Bette, ever the innovator, turned petroleum jelly into her secret weapon. It might sound old school and even a little messy, but it worked. Her eyes became her trademark, immortalized in the famous song Bette Davis Eyes. It's almost like she was doing her own makeup experiments before it became trendy, using whatever she had on hand to get the look she wanted. It's one of those details that really captures how resourceful she was, never shying away from a little discomfort if it meant delivering a better performance. It's no wonder she became known as one of the greatest actresses of her time. And you have to admire that stubborn dedication to her craft. Sure, putting petroleum jelly on your eyelids might not make the cut in a modern beauty routine, but Bette wasn't about to let convention get in the way of her vision. It's kind of the perfect metaphor for her whole career, don't you think? She did things her way, unapologetically, even if it wasn't always pretty or perfect. And that's exactly why she stood out. Marilyn Monroe's night care. She might have been the most glamorous star of all time, but her beauty routine had a few secrets that most people wouldn't expect. One of her most famous habits, she would slather her face with Vaseline before bed, like a glossy, sticky mask. It sounds like something straight out of a DIY skincare guide, but Marilyn swore by it. Now, you have to remember, this was long before the days of high-end night creams and fancy serums. For Marilyn, Vaseline was her go-to, and she used it liberally. She believed that coating her face with that thick layer of petroleum jelly would keep her skin soft, dewy, and youthful, almost like it could trap in every ounce of moisture. She had this idea that if she kept her skin well hydrated, it would stay smooth and wrinkle-free, even as she juggled the grueling demands of Hollywood. So Marilyn, with her signature platinum blonde curls and that famous pout, would be getting ready for bed in her elegant bedroom. Instead of a fancy routine, she'd reach for a jar of Vaseline, smoothing it over her cheeks, her forehead, and even her eyelids. She must have looked almost like a porcelain doll under a glossy sheen as she slipped into bed. And it wasn't just about the moisture. Marilyn also believed that the heavy layer of Vaseline created a sort of glow, like it would somehow work magic overnight. Maybe she liked the way it made her feel pampered, even when she wasn't on set or in front of the cameras. It was her little ritual, a way to take care of herself in a world that always wanted more from her. But let's be real. Most dermatologists today would probably cringe at the idea. Slathering Vaseline over your whole face can trap dirt and bacteria, clog pores, and lead to breakouts. Yet, Marilyn wasn't afraid to do things her own way, even if it meant waking up with a sticky pillow. And to be fair, it did give her that famous glow that made her look like she was lit from within. It's such a fitting detail about her, don't you think? Marilyn was always balancing between being this untouchable icon and this very vulnerable, very human woman. She had insecurities like anyone else, but she tried to take control of her image in whatever ways she could, even if it meant turning to an old jar of Vaseline to keep that youthful allure alive. And that's the side of Marilyn that's so fascinating. She was glamorous, yes, but she was also just a person trying to hold on to a little bit of magic, one nighttime ritual at a time. Errol Flynn's lack of bathing. He was the ultimate bad boy of classic Hollywood. The guy practically invented the swashbuckling hero with his role in The Adventures of Robin Hood. But behind the scenes, he had a reputation for being a bit less polished than his screen persona. In fact, one of the most well-known quirks about Errol was that he wasn't too keen on regular bathing. And believe it or not, it kind of became part of his charm, or at least part of his roguish legend. Flynn was always this wild, larger-than-life character, on and off the screen. He lived for adventure, whether it was sword fighting in the movies or sailing around the world in his spare time. And to be honest, taking a bath just didn't seem to fit into that lifestyle. He'd sometimes go days, even longer, without a proper wash, relying more on his natural charisma than any soap and water. His co-stars and colleagues definitely noticed. Stories floated around about how he might show up on set smelling a bit earthy. But here's the thing. Somehow, Errol managed to pull it off. Instead of hurting his reputation, it just added to his mystique. He was like this untamed, unpredictable force, a little rough around the edges, but impossible to resist. It's as if people expected him to be a bit unrefined, and that just made him seem even more authentic, more of a real-life pirate than a Hollywood actor. And maybe there was a method to his madness. Errol wasn't just playing Robin Hood, he was Robin Hood, living by his own rules, defying social norms, and staying true to that free-spirited nature that made him a star. In a town where everything was so meticulously managed and polished, he was a guy who didn't seem to care about the usual standards. And for a lot of fans, that was a big part of his appeal. Of course, his laid-back approach to hygiene wasn't always charming to those around him. You can imagine the makeup artists and costume designers trying to manage things when Errol rolled in after a late night or a few too many days without a shower. But he wasn't about to change just to fit into some Hollywood mold. If anything, he leaned into the rumors and shrugged them off with a smirk, as he did with so much else in his wild and controversial life. It's kind of like he knew that being the perfectly groomed gentleman just wasn't his brand. He was the guy who made adventure look easy, who made danger seem fun, and who didn't mind getting a little dirty along the way. And that's exactly what made Errol Flynn unforgettable. He embraced the messiness, the chaos, and the freedom that came with living life on his own terms. Sure, he might have skipped a few baths, but in the end, that just made his legend all the more intriguing. Marlene Dietrich's face shaving. With her striking features and charm, she became an icon of glamour and sophistication in classic Hollywood. But behind that polished facade lay a beauty secret that might surprise you. She regularly shaved her face. Yes, you heard that right. The legendary actress believed that shaving her face helped keep her skin looking smooth and flawless. Picture it. Marlene in her glamorous dressing room surrounded by lights and makeup artists. While most women were busy applying layers of foundation and concealer, Marlene took a different approach. Every day she would take a razor to her skin, carefully gliding it over her cheeks and chin. Her reasoning? She believed that by removing the fine hairs from her face, she would achieve a more refined, even complexion that would look stunning under the bright studio lights. Now, you might think that sounds a bit extreme or even a little risky, but for Marlene, it was all about maintaining that ethereal glow that made her so captivating on screen. This unconventional method not only helped her skin look smoother, but it also exfoliated dead skin cells, leaving her complexion fresh and radiant. Imagine the reaction from her contemporaries. While other stars might have raised an eyebrow at her technique, Marlene was unapologetic. She embraced her uniqueness and was always looking for ways to stand out. In a Hollywood where beauty standards often leaned toward the traditional and predictable, she was a breath of fresh air, challenging norms and setting trends. And here's the kicker. Her dedication to this beauty ritual paid off. Marlene Dietrich had a timeless quality to her looks, which was part of why she became such an enduring symbol of beauty. Even in her later years, she maintained that radiant, youthful appearance that made her a legend. So the next time you think of Marlene Dietrich, Remember that beneath the glamorous exterior was a woman who wasn't afraid to embrace unconventional methods to achieve her beauty goals. She showed us that sometimes stepping outside the norm, like shaving your face, can lead to striking results. Carrie Grant's face bath. When you have distinctively chiseled features, you tend to do whatever it takes to keep it, so Carrie often splashed his face with ice-cold water multiple times a day. He believed this refreshing ritual tightened his skin, reduced puffiness, and helped him maintain a youthful, sharp appearance. Think of it as a classic version of today's cryotherapy trends, but without the fancy gadgets, just a simple bowl of cold water. This daily routine was more than just a beauty hack. It reflected Grant's dedication to his appearance and his desire to look his best for the camera. The cool water invigorated him and kept his complexion looking fresh, a crucial element for a leading man in Hollywood's golden age, and it clearly paid off. Grant's commitment to this simple yet effective regimen helped him retain his stunning looks well into middle age, proving that sometimes the simplest methods can lead to the most enduring results.